Good evening, my friends. Good evening, and welcome to the 10th webinar of Season 11 of the National Humanities Center's Humanities in Class webinar series. As always, this is Mike Williams coming to you live from a frigid Research Triangle Park. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the NHC. It's always a pleasure to be here with you all. I sincerely hope that you all are doing well and staying warm or staying cool in your respective parts. I've been looking forward to this webinar for some time now, as it's led by one of our former fellows and a good friend of education programs, who I was fortunate to work with early on in my time here at the NHC to build our Understanding the Modern Middle East course shortly before the pandemic. And Dr. Akram Khater has been indeed a friend of our program. So I'm looking forward to having him and Lindsey on tonight. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right. Tonight's session is entitled Challenging the Collective Memory Approach, using Arab American labor history to expand U.S. history curricula. As I mentioned, that's being led by Dr. Akram Khater and Lindsey Payne, both of NC State University, who are going to be here tonight. So we have two presenters, so we're super excited about this evening. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and for 48 years, we've supported the best in the humanities scholarship. We are, in fact, the only private nonprofit institution in the world devoted exclusively to the study of the humanities. I lead a team here at the NHC Education Programs team that includes a staff who's passionate about this work and who are committed to ensuring that our programming meets the needs of all teachers at all levels. Our goal is to build those bridges between the scholarly world and your classroom. And we not only support educators at the K-12 level, but we have collegiate, we have graduate level educations as well. We have community college instructors. We have museum docents and leaders of cultural sites who are all joining in. And of course, our media specialists who are here as well. I want to take a few moments to update you all on all the things that's happening at the National Humanities Center. And again, to hear more about what's happening, I invite you to visit us at nationalhumanitiescenter.org. On the main page, you will find featured research, forming and transforming communities. This month, we highlight the research of 26 fellows whose projects examines the ways communities created through proximity or shared experience are formed and transform in response to crisis. Also, held recently at the World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, in conversation how to disagree agreeably, brought together Dr. Cornel West, who's a progressive, and conservative Robert George, who are in fact good friends and are united by their interests in great thinkers from past and by the commitment to live respectful, commitment to lively, respectable debate for a conversation on the question that matters. If you're interested in checking that out, you can find the recording on the World War I YouTube page. And lastly, in partnership with humanists and organizations across the world, the Being 2026 Being Humanist Festival will be held from April 18th to May 2nd, 2026. Featuring a range of public humanities events. This initiative will support the development of programming for diverse non-academic audiences across geographic regions and subject areas. And as you have heard me say a few times before, super excited to announce that registration is open for the 2026 Teaching African American Studies Institute, which will be hosted on the historic campus of Prairie View A&M University, which is just west of Houston, Texas. This will be our sixth institute in the series, which began in June of 2022. I will be there. I'll be joined by a select group of passionate interdisciplinary applications all over the country, educators who will apply from all over the country from June 15th through 20th. So if you're interested in applying, the registration window is open now. We'd love to have you join us. Teaching the digital diaspora will move beyond traditional resources to explore how digital humanities can illuminate the complexities of the African diaspora. Participants will work with scholars to understand how these tools reveal hidden histories of resistance, self-determination, and artistic contribution across vast geographies and time periods. We will accept applications until March 30th, 2026. I am so incredibly fortunate to work with alongside a strong and talented teacher advisory council. These are educators from all over the country who give us feedback and consult with us on various projects. Our current council began their council year August 1st, and their term will expire July 31st. In the coming months, we will open up our applications for the 26-27 Teacher Advisory Council. More information will be coming up, and best believe I will be letting you all know via the webinar introduction. So if there's something you have considered, please consider applying. If you or your colleagues would like to check out recordings of past webinars, please navigate to our webinars landing page and follow the webinar archives link to our dedicated YouTube page, where you'll find past recordings. And I always have to announce this. Please note that viewings of past recordings are not eligible for CEU and no professional development hours. You get those professional development hours by being here. All right, so you have to be here. Hello, Hassan from Morocco. I see you in the chat. But if you are interested, again, in checking out past recordings, please feel free to check out the past recordings. However, in order to get those precious CEU and or professional development hours, you have to be here during the live session. Tonight's webinar is audio and PowerPoint based, so you will not see our speakers directly, but you will be able to interact with all three of us through the chat box. Now, there are actually two primary chat boxes. One is the audience chat box that you all are using right now and doing a great job of it, mind you. But then there's also the question and answer, or the Q&A chat. If you should have any questions throughout the evening for either of our presenters, I will be monitoring those questions and bringing them to their attention throughout the presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Challenging the Collective Memory Approach Using Arab American Labor History to Expand U.S. History Curricula. Our leader for this session is Dr. Akram Khater. We're also joined by Lindsey Payne, who will be joining us this afternoon. Dr. Khater is NHC Fellow 2005-2006. He's a professor of history. He's the director of the Curricula Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University. We also have advisors for the evening, TAs, Jayson, Chang, and Hannah May, who are members of this year's Teacher Advisory Council. Dr. Akram Khater is University Faculty Scholar, Professor of History, and holds the Curricula Chair in Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University, where he also serves as the director of the Curricula Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. A native of Lebanon, he earned a BS degree in electrical engineering from California Polytechnical State University and holds MA and PhD degrees in history from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and University of California, Berkeley, respectively. His books include Inventing Home, Immigration, Gender, and the Making of a Lebanese Middle Class, 1861 to 1921, and A History of the Middle East, a source book for the history of the Middle East and North Africa, and Embracing the Divine Passion in Politics in Christian Middle East. He has completed a PBS documentary on the history of Lebanese community in North Carolina, and is the senior curator for a museum exhibit on the same topic. He has published a substantial number of articles and reviews, and has made conference presentations throughout the United States and internationally. He has delivered over 300 talks on topics relating to the Middle East, Professor Khater has been awarded a number of teaching accolades and grants during his tenure at NC State University and also obtained fellowships from the National Humanities Center, American Philosophical Society, National Endowment for the Humanities, Fulbright, and many, many others. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Khater here. And also we are joined by Lindsey Payne. Lindsey is currently a doctoral candidate at NC State University, specializing in teacher education and learning sciences with a focus on social studies. Working under the mentorship of Dr. Megan Manfra, who is awesome. Her primary research is examining how historical trajectories influence outcomes in social studies education. Akram and Lindsey, we're incredibly fortunate to have you here tonight. I'm excited for your talk, and we are so very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. I am deeply gratified by all the work that went towards putting this together. I really appreciate the work of the National Humanities Center. They are truly a leading organization in protecting and advancing teaching of the humanities at every level in this country. I'm also very happy that I will be joined with my colleague Lindsey Payne, and I'll describe in a little bit kind of the division of labor between us. But I also want to say to all of you who are attending, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. We very much look forward to your questions, and we hope that we'll be able to answer as many of them as we can. So tonight we are going to be focusing on this story, if you will, of Arab American labor. I shared with you the link that took you to this digital humanities projects that we developed. Let me tell you a little bit of background first about who we are as a center at North Carolina State University. Then I'm going to shift to talking about how we conceived of this project and what drove us to do it, if you will, as well as some of the major findings that we had. Once I get to that point, I'm going to turn the time over to Lindsey to talk about the educational resources that we built around this project. At any time, please feel free to ask us questions. When one of us are talking, I think Mike will be monitoring the questions, and he will bring them to our attention as we're talking. And so I don't want this to be just nonstop talking. So if you have questions about a slide, about a concept, about the overall theme, by all means, please ask those questions through the Q&A, and we will try to stop and answer those on the fly. Of course, we will also leave time at the end for Q&A if you prefer to do it that way. So first of all, a couple words about who we are as a center and why we developed this project. So the center that I direct at North Carolina State University is called the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. And we take the term Lebanese here a little bit loosely. We're talking primarily that our mission as a center is to preserve and share the history of Arabic-speaking peoples from the area in the Eastern Mediterranean, West Asia, primarily what we know today as Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel. And so in that area, there are a great number of immigrants left that area, and of course, subsequently from other parts of the Middle East, and they travel throughout the world, including the United States. And I'll get that back to that in a bit. So the center is dedicated to preserving these histories from the earliest times that people left in the 1880s and 1890s to more recent immigrations. And we built an archive built around that, and then we use that archive to tell stories. And these stories could be anything from documentaries, and we made several of those, to museum exhibits, to digital humanities projects and digital exhibits, to teacher workshops, scholarly gatherings. So you can understand that it runs the gamut. And the whole point of it is that we would like to share this information with as broad of a group of people as we can. And to do so, we also work to develop archival technologies. Now, this project that we're going to be talking about tonight is part of that, if you will, spectrum of projects that we usually do. And it's specifically digital humanities projects. And I'm happy to I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of it, because I think it's important to understand, how we went about it. But first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we came to conceive of this. So for those of you who with, and you may not have it, I just decided to put in a QR code here that you can log on to so you can see the project all together, if you will. So a little bit of background. one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides here, then I come back to the other slide. Generally speaking, if you think about Arabs and Arab Americans, as well, there's this kind of preconceived notion about who they are. They are always constituted as the other, as an alien group of people that hold alien and to a certain extent hostile values to the United States. They are recent immigrants. And if you look at Hollywood images, if you look at political discussions about them, if you look at coverage from the media, generally speaking, you will find that there's been a consistent representation of Arabs and Arab Americans as at least, alien, but also quite often a threat. The images are, quite negative for the most part. Nothing surprising here. For, a long period of time, you also find that they don't exist in any of the histories of the United States. They are elided from that story. So what we try to do as a center is we try to tell stories about this community that has been here for over 150 years, that actually is part of the very fabric of this United States, that is part of the fabric of the Americas in general, because they immigrated, of course, to Central and South America as well, and that they have contributed and they have added to it in so many ways, culturally, economically, socially, religiously, in every spectrum you can imagine, and yet they have always been consistently kept out of it. And very specifically, to go back here, one of the things that you find is that when it comes to talking about the history of labor in this area, the problem is that Arab American workers have been completely absent from standard labor narratives and archives at every level. And here I'm talking, if you look at K through 12, or if you're looking at college, you rarely ever see the mention of Arab American workers. They are usually hidden under the larger category of immigrants. And in fact, in terms of people's minds, they don't exist at all as a group who participated in the building of this country, if you will, from its earliest period of time. So what this project tries to do is to move beyond this illusion, to go beyond it. Now, there's a second problem. And the second problem is that the community itself holds a narrative that Arabic-speaking peoples arrived here. They became first peddlers. These are itinerant, merchants, people who would walk the roads of America and sell. They would be carrying suitcases, and they would sell from them to these farming communities, small towns, whether it's in North Carolina or whether it is in Arizona or Oklahoma. And the narrative goes from there that you start out as peddlers and then slowly they become merchants. So there's this kind of linear narrative, if you will, that they go immediately from peddling to merchants. And never in that narrative do you find any mention of them working in factories, in coal mines, on the farms. And so in many ways, this project is meant to tackle two absences within the narrative. One is if you look at the narrative of American labor, the history of American labor, you do not see the mention at all of anybody who is of Arab descent or Arabic speaking involved in it. Two, within the Arab American community itself, the prevailing narrative, at least, not necessarily the scholarly one, but the prevailing one, is that they were very much oriented towards commerce and merchandising and selling things, that they were never part, if you will, of labor. So what we wanted to do with this project is we wanted to recenter Arab Americans as an integral part of U.S. labor history and U.S. history in general. So that's really the goal behind it. And as I said, it's partly to sort of, work against this countervailing image of who Arabs are. Now, one of the things that I would like to also emphasize is just a little bit of the background about immigration. So Arabs have been, or Arabic-speaking peoples, have been immigrating to the United States from the 1880s till basically yesterday. And the first group left between the 1880s and 1924, where we begin to see the Immigration Act that restricts immigration from anywhere outside Western and Northern Europe, take place and go into effect. So between 1880 and 1924, the majority of the people who immigrated came, as I said, from what we know today as Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel. These were Arabic-speaking. They are a mix of religions. The majority tended to be Christian, but there were a lot of Muslims as well, and a significant number, of course, of Arabic-speaking Jews. And they came primarily from villages. So if you were to look at the demographic shape of this population, it would be primarily people coming from villages. Most of them were not necessarily literate. And what drove most of them to emigrate in this time period is the same thing that brought Italians, that brought people from Poland, and brought various other people. And this is what we call the Great, Transatlantic Migration, throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century. Specifically, they came to an America that's growing. And here I'm talking about America in all of its sectors, not just the United States, but also places like Brazil and Argentina, whose economies were in need of labor. So they came, like many other immigrants, to work, to accumulate funds, and most of them actually wanted to return, like most immigrants wanted to do. So that's, if you will, what we consider to be the first wave. Then you have 1924 that, in essence, brings to a grinding halt the immigration of anybody who is not white from Northern Europe or from Western Europe. And until we get the repeal of that in 1964, you basically have a lull in immigration, particularly from Arabic-speaking countries, with one small exception, which is a percentage of about between 75 and 100,000 Palestinians who were, after the creation of the state of Israel, were pushed out of their ancestral homes, and some of them ended up in the United States. But then after 1964, when, thanks to the civil rights movement, we begin to see the removal of racial quotas from immigration, then you begin to see a renewed entry of Arabic-speaking peoples. This time around, you do see people from the original areas that I talked about, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, as well as Syria. But now they're joined by Iraqis, by Yemenis, by Egyptians, by North Africans. You begin to see other Arabic-speaking peoples coming in. A lot of them, of course, are arriving here to go attend college, to go to get higher education degrees. They're not coming in as large families as the first wave. They're coming in primarily as one or by themselves or as a couple at most, and they settle here and create their families here. I want to show you a little bit of this map before I start talking about the project itself, because this map shows you how widespread this population was. In essence, by 1930, you would be hard-pressed to find a county in the United States that did not have some number of Arabic-speaking peoples, or Arab Americans, if you will, who are living in that county. It's a fairly widespread population in that sense. And what we're talking about in terms of numbers are the following. If you look at the first time frame, the 1880s all the way to 1924, we estimate about 100,000 people came to North America, and another 200,000 went to Central and South America, with the bulk going to Argentina and Brazil. But in the United States itself, we have about 100,000 arriving in that time frame. Today, we estimate there are about 3.3 million Arab Americans in the United States, including the second wave that I talked about, and of course, people who descend from both the first and the second wave, parentage and ancestors. Now, these numbers are all, to a certain extent, a little bit of a guesswork, because, for example, when we talk about the census, I think many of you understand that the census is incredibly inaccurate, especially when we're talking about smaller populations. So, smaller populations tend to be under counted, and that's a problem that has been addressed many times. I served on the U.S. Census Bureau Ethnic and Racial Board, and one of our tasks was to actually address that. We don't necessarily need to go there, but it's just something that I do not think that 3.3 million is actually accurate, but we'll take it as a figure. So, in essence, you're looking at a sort of fairly growth of about 100,000 around, the year 1920 to now to about 3.3 million in the United States. And throughout this stretch of time, from the 1880s to, as I said yesterday, those who are arriving here, like many other immigrants, are arriving for work. Some of them, end up doing, of course, peddling or merchants, but others actually go into labor, what we consider to be working class labor. That is factories, farms, mines, you name it, in that regard. Now, the project itself focuses on a stretch of time from the 1880s all the way to the 1970s. Specifically, what the project is that it's a web-based digital history project using interactive story maps, again, to situate labor in lived, urban, and rural spaces. And what we did actually, we built it specific, the whole foundation of this was brought from extensive archival research, oral history, census data, and historical maps. And it was designed specifically for K through 12 educators, students, and the general public. So a lot of our digital humanities projects are meant specifically to be accessible and to be navigable. And again, I hope that some of you or all of you have had the chance to go through the project itself and to go through the various things. Now, the way we designed this project, as I said, is we tell, in essence, 6 stories. There's one that I didn't put on this map here, and I'll explain in a second why it's not on the map. So as you can see, we look at New York City and the garment shops from the 1880s to the 1930s. We look at Massachusetts and textile factories from the 1890s to the 1950s. Detroit from the 19-teens, really, 1910s, all the way to the 1960s. The American West, coal mines from the 1890s to the 1920s, and California agricultural labor from the 1960s and 1970s. What is not on the map here are performers, because that's another form of labor. And the reason we didn't put them on is because by the very nature of these performers, whether they were in Hollywood or they were with the Barnum Circus, they are traveling all over the United States. So they weren't really physically located. And it's also important to understand that these are case studies. This is not a coverage of all the people who worked everywhere in the United States in terms of labor. For example, there were many who worked in the oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma early on, and the coal mines of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. But we didn't include that because we actually are looking, as I said, at case studies. We're trying to understand that. So keep in mind then that this is not an exhaustive one, although it gives you a fairly large, good idea about how widespread that employment was altogether. Now, what I would like to shift to, here, is to talk a little bit about the issues of sources. As I said earlier, we really, use a wide variety of sources. One of the things that became very evident to us is that the traditional archives themselves were not identifying Arab American workers. What we found is that in labor archives, they're not mentioned. There's no mention. And in fact, we contacted one of the largest labor archives in the United States, based in Michigan, at Michigan State University, and we told them about the project we are undertaking. And they, the director of the archive was very, candid with us and said, yeah, we do not have a category that includes, that identifies Arab Americans or Arabs who are working, despite the fact, for example, that in Detroit, you basically had about 3.5% of auto workers who are of Arab descent. So they were not insignificant. We're not saying that the largest number, but they were not certainly insignificant either. And yet there was nothing that identified them. When we looked at archives that dealt with labor strikes, that dealt with garment shops in New York, again, we found that they were not mentioned at all. So there was a serious systematic problem in which they're just not there. And as you very well know as educators yourselves, that the lack, when they're not there, they're completely not integrated into the story. They appear as completely outside the boundaries of the story, or whatever story you're telling. And that in itself is a serious problem. So in many ways, and we are very grateful here, I must say, to the Arab American National Museum that has some archives. The Arab American National Museum is located in Dearborn, Michigan. And they are an organization we collaborate with a lot. And fortunately, they had some archives that pertain to the subject that we're talking about. There were some oral histories that they had collected with auto workers. So that was very helpful to us in that regard. But we, in many ways, as we were building this project, we also had to build the archive itself. We had to go find the material everywhere. What that basically entailed is that we had to find descendants of people who worked, and we had to do oral histories with them. For example, in Colorado and the mines out there, we found out, some of the main names, and we started looking to find if there anybody within the state of Colorado or outside it for that matter, who is of that family. We contacted them, and we were able to successfully interview 5 people whose, grandparents and parents worked in the coal mines in Colorado and actually Utah and Arizona as well. So we had to basically start building that archive in order to tell the story. Then, another route we took is we have a major project on Arab American newspapers. And these are newspapers published in Arabic between 1880 and 1970. It's a searchable database. Pretty soon it's going to be searchable actually in English. You don't even have to type in Arabic, and it will bring back articles that contain whatever you're searching for, and you can automatically translate it into English if you need to, or Spanish or Portuguese or French for that matter. And so this database that we have built became an important source for us because we found that actually, even though the major newspapers talking about any of the labor issues did not necessarily identify people as Arab, or quite frankly, they were called Syrians at the time because they came from greater Syria geographically. What we found is that the Arabic language newspapers in the United States did write about these things. So that became a very valuable source. It's an archive we had already been building, and it proved incredibly helpful. We also found that the United States Census was helpful in many ways to allow us to begin to understand, where these folks are, how many people lived in Montana and worked around a coal mining town who were of Syrian or Arabic, if you will, Arab background. So as I'm trying to explain here, what we really were trying to build is the archive itself. We found ourselves needing to build the archive in various parts in order to tell the story. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like to focus on is what is this story? Let me see if and I can answer some of these questions in just a bit. But so again, before I turn it over to Lindsey to talk about the educational resources that we built around it. So what did we discover after all of this? What is the point of all of this? Obviously, I cannot summarize the whole thing. For those of you who have gone through the project, you can see that's incredibly extensive. And the project, again, to describe it in case you haven't had the chance to go through it, or you will go through it later, is made up of chapters, as I said. So you have an introduction, and you have the 5 things that I alluded to, coal mining, farming, garment, textile factories, auto factories and performers, so those things. And then you have a tab for educational resources. Now, if you go to each one of these chapters, if you will, as we imagine them to be, that tells part of that story. Within that, you will find a combination of text, images, sometimes we have interviews or even film, a lot of mapping, and at the same time, this mapping is interactive because it allows you to get more details about whether you're mapping where Arabs lived in Montana or in Detroit, or where Yemeni farm workers, how they traveled up and down California in terms of work and the seasonal work that they did. So we did a lot of this kind of mapping. So each one of these things, chapters, has a combination of this very rich storytelling that allows a variety of ways to interact with the data in that regard. Now, before I get to the point of what basically I would summarize our conclusion, and I'm happy to talk, by the way, in details about any of the chapters that you are interested in, but let me address a couple of things that were asked here, and I will try to answer them. So question number 13, I think, is historically when Arabs arrived in the United States, did they receive the scrutiny that the Jews did after World War II? Yeah, so very early on, the idea that these Arabs were arriving, whether they're coming through the border, across the border from Mexico into Texas, they're going through New Orleans, or the great majority of them arrive through Ellis, they absolutely get scrutinized. As you all very well know, because you've been teaching this, the arrival of large number of immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, created a great deal of racial anxiety amongst, the majority white population, in which they did not want these, to quote unquote, whether they're Catholic Italians or whether they are Arab, Christians or Muslims for that matter, to come and somehow alter the nature. So the idea of scrutiny was already there. And like with a lot of other immigrants, the scrutiny was built around stereotypes and biases. Very simply, for example, one is that immigrants are indolent. They are lazy. They don't want to work. So that was one of those kind of things that were scrutinized, whether they're going to become wardens of the state, as they were called. In other words, they would go on welfare. When in fact, we know that the story of immigrants is that they come here and they work harder than anybody else. But the other element of it is that immigrants as vectors of disease. In the case of these early immigrants, 1880, 1924, the one big issue that they were identified with was trachoma. With the Jewish community coming in, they were identified with tuberculosis, although actually they have the lowest rate of infection with tuberculosis. With the Arabic-speaking population that I'm talking about, trachoma, that is an eye disease, they would always be, there was some people that were turned away. But generally speaking, when they were turned away, they would end up going to Cuba, to Central America, to Mexico, and then they would try to make their way into the United States. Or if that's not successful, they would, stay in Central America or even go further south to places like Argentina or Brazil. So yes, they were always under scrutiny, and their bodies were very much suspect. So if you find a woman trying to cross the border between Mexico and Texas, immediately the assumption is that there's something about her moral standing, that she's suspect because of that, in that regard. And the second question, were there any U.S. government programs in trying to get Arab immigrants to fill labor roles in the United States? So no, it wasn't a government program. But what actually was happening is a lot of these factories were sending agents, not just to the Middle East, but they were sending agents to Italy, to Greece, to try to actively recruit. And what facilitated that recruitment, I mean, obviously they would offer them labor contracts, and sometimes they would hire people of the same ethnicity/nationality to be those agents because they spoke the language, and they would promise them all sorts of, things. But you may remember with the Ford plant in Detroit and Dearborn, Michigan, it was a $5 day, right? Which is where the Ford plant doubled the amount of money they paid for a day's worth of work. And that $5 day becomes a sort of infamous thing that attracted people to Detroit, including Arabic-speaking peoples who had gotten the news. Because one of the things that's also important to understand that immigration happens for a variety of reasons, of course. The recruiting I talked about is part of it. The creation of steamship navigation, which cut down the travel time drastically and reduced the cost of travel. And also the steamship companies themselves tried to advertise in order to encourage immigration to get more traffic. But actually, one of the largest factors is word of mouth through the network of immigrants themselves. In other words, these immigrants lived transnational lives even then, even before the age of WhatsApp and internet. Letters were slower, but letters still were highly effective. And letters they sent home, money they sent home, as people do today, were ways in which they recruited family members to come and join them in that regard. So that's how you find, for the most part, how people came. When Yemeni workers arrived in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, what you find is, as one of the elders of the community in Dearborn told an interviewer, he said, it depends upon who you end up living with. If you live with somebody who works in farming, you become a farming, agricultural, go into agricultural labor. If you stay with somebody who actually works in an auto factory, you end up with that kind of job. So again, the networking is far more critical in that sense than a U.S. program. But I'm not aware of any U.S. programs that focus on Arabs. So let me wrap up my section a little bit because I really am anxious to have you guys engage with what we're talking about and with the project. And I also want to give time to Lindsey. So what is it after all of this? So as I said at the beginning, our goal was really quite simple. We want to bring Arab Americans into the story of American labor history because they have been kept out both by the narrative that was told within the community and by the narrative that's told by scholars and the general public, if you will. So that's why we went about collecting this material and telling the story. So what kind of things did we find? First of all, what I think became, as you may have found from the description, is that as with any of these things, there's an intersection of gender and race and class, right? They become very important. So first of all, we found that on average, at any one point, here I'm talking about probably the period, especially from 1880 to 1940, 1/3 of people who are of Arab descent were working in some kind of labor force. It could be auto work, it could be textile factories, it could be coal mines, it could be farms. About 1/3 are working, which is a significant number. The second thing we also discovered is that there is a high percentage of women who were involved in labor. Again, this goes against the narrative on both parts, both the narrative about how people imagine quote unquote Arab women to be, and also the narrative of the community itself. So the notion of, again, I put it between quotations, Arab or Muslim women in general, is that it's such a conservative society, they don't work outside the house. And the reality is that is not true in the Middle East, and certainly was not true in the United States. We find that in some cases, 50% of the Arabic-speaking workforce was female, especially when it comes to textile factories and garment shops. Not so much within farming and agricultural labor, and not so much within coal mining. But in the auto sector, they had a high representation as well. In performers, they had a high representation as well. So in other words, we discovered not only is that a third of Arabic-speaking peoples between 1880 and the 1950s were working in some form of working class job or labor, but we also found that in some instances, 50% of those who are working, who are Arabic speakers, were women. And in fact, when we looked at places like Lawrence, Massachusetts, and textile factories in the early 20th century, even more than 50% were working, women were working. And we're talking about girls all the way to adult women. Some of these, child labor was starting at the age of 13 or 14, and some of them, to get the job early to help their family, they would forge a document saying when they were born. So that's a second discovery that we had. The third discovery is that not only is it that they were widespread in terms of the kind of work they did, and geographically they were widespread, but from every instance we studied, what we found is they were heavily involved in labor organizing and leadership. I will just take one example because I don't want to take up too much more time. But one example is the Bread and Roses strike, which is the first major labor strike in the United States in the early 20th century. What we found from our research is that of the organizing committee, 3 members were quote-unquote Syrians, that is the label that was given to them for the people who come from, again, from what we know today as Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel. So these early Arab Americans were overrepresented, because if you looked at the number of Arab American workers in the textile factories in Lawrence, Massachusetts, they were not represented, they were not the same high percentage as the leadership committee for the strike that took place. And 1 out of the 3 people who were killed in that strike was himself a young man young Arab American man. So what we also discovered very quickly as well is that once the strike was over, they were heavily involved in creating some of the earliest major labor unions in the United States, what ultimately ends up being the AFL-CIO. But that pattern of not only being part of labor, but taking part in the labor organizing and labor strikes and labor leadership was widespread. Now, at the same time, I don't want to give the impression that somehow everybody who worked there immediately was involved in that. That's not the case at all. You see some people who just work there to make money and they wanted nothing to do with organizing or strikes, which again is a very normal thing. And many of them, especially men, left factory work as fast as they can because they found that within factory work there was an emasculation of them and they preferred to just get out of that business. But women and girls stayed there and they were highly active in organizing at that level. And what we also found is that the community itself was split over supporting or opposing strikes. So that's the other element that we found. And finally, there are a lot of other things that, individual findings, again, they're all in the project. What we finally found is that these memories of being part of labor didn't disappear. Rather, they are part of family lore. And this brings me to an important point about public history. Because far too often, we tell stories that are built on these very formal archives that in many ways does not allow the community a full voice. And so, in essence then, what we have discovered in the process of doing this project is that the stories are there. We just had to go find them. And that's what I meant when I said we had to build the archive, because we only could do it because the community had held on to those stories. Now, some of them may have are no longer working in labor, and we all know very now that labor is under attack. But nonetheless, many of them took pride in the kind of work that their family did. And what we find that to be important is that because it changes people's conception, not only just about Arab Americans, but about this kind of work that they did and how they built this country. And that's the final thing I will end up with. In every sector, what we found is that these early Arab Americans, and I would argue later ones as well, were integral in every aspect of America's history. Building roads, constructing railroads, digging mines, farming and feeding people, building cars, you name it, they were involved in that process. In other words, we went out asking the question, how involved they were, and our answer was they were central and integral to that history. Now, I'm going to just turn it over in a bit, but there's one question that came up, is what made factory work emasculating? It's a great question. If you look at the history of labor, early American labor, you find that immigrant labor was absolutely central. But the hierarchy, immigrant labor, of course, and Black labor and Latino and Latinx labor was integral. But in terms of the hierarchy of power, the foremen were generally white, and they treated immigrants, in using racial slurs. They attacked them as, in essence, feminine. And so it was the work environment itself and the way that they were being treated that made them feel, if you will, emasculated. But it wasn't just how they were treated, because if you think about labor, especially after the establishment of the Ford factory, it becomes an assembly line in which you really are just sitting there doing one thing repetitively for hours on end. And many of these people are coming from an area that they were farmers. Even if they didn't own the land, there was a sense of kind of pride of growing things from beginning to end. And, this capitalist factory, in many ways, becomes a dehumanizing experience. And in that sense, they begin to lose a sense of identity. But on top of all of that, we have to keep in mind that in immigrating, you always feel, you're immigrating into a country that at best is indifferent, but more often than not hostile to who you are, to your whole self. So you have to give up some of that. And in many ways, moving away from that kind of environment that I talked about in the factory was seen by some that it allows them to maintain a greater sense of identity. I'll talk about the recommendations for narrative media and stuff later, but I'm going to turn it over to Lindsey because I've spoken long enough. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to further questions.
Okay, thank you so much. I am absolutely honored to be speaking with all of you today. As previously mentioned, I am a doctoral candidate in the Teacher Education and Learning Sciences within the College of Education at NC State. So my role within this project is to create usable lesson plans, usable, pragmatic educational resources that you can use within your classroom to expand the historical narratives that your students are exposed to. If you want to, you can scan the QR code on your screen, and that should pull up the educational resources, or you can scroll down to the bottom of that link to access those resources. So I'm going to give everyone just a second to scan the QR code if they need to, just so they can follow along. Okay, perfect. Moving along, I did want to address that the C3 lessons that we have created to go along with the Arab American labor webpage does follow North Carolina state standards. A lot of times there is potentially pushback about expanding historical narratives or trying something different in the classroom. There is this pervasive pressure of, different standards that you need to follow. So we made sure that all of our materials do follow North Carolina state standards for social studies. So we just wanted to make you aware of that. So what really inspired the creation and dissemination of these lesson plans? Just broadly speaking, thinking about the epistemological assumptions that underpin history classrooms, it's not really much of a surprise that you often hear your students bemoan, oh, I'm not a history person, history's not for me. I was a history teacher for 8 years, and that was often something I had to combat in my students, this inherent feeling that history is passive and boring and not something relevant that they can engage in. So obviously, history has been maligned as a dry and irrelevant subject by many students and, adults. Often people say they are not a history person, and that's because history is often positioned as something that students just need to get through, not something they engage with. Oh, I need to learn this battle, or I need to learn these names and dates to pass my end of year exam, or, it's just something I need to get through for enough credits to graduate. Students see history as just memorization, names, dates, and a myriad of disconnected facts that aren't really relevant to their life or their experiences. This reputation doesn't come from the discipline itself. Obviously, when you engage with history within higher education, a lot of times you start to develop an understanding of how history works. But that is how it's typically taught in a lot of classrooms. When students don't see relevance to their lives, history can feel distant, unimportant, irrelevant. And this leads to what Van Sledwright calls the collective memory approach to history that dominates a lot of K-12 classrooms. So students are expected to receive information rather than construct meaning. Teachers act as the authority, and the textbook is the ultimate final word, usually within this style of instruction. And unfortunately, burgeoning literature suggests that if the textbook is used as the final word, many textbooks do not even speak to the Arab American experience at all. So a lot of content analysis recently within secondary textbook analysis has suggested that Arab American experiences are completely devoid from most K-12 textbooks. Students rarely have the ability to engage in the practices that historians actually use in their profession. And again, this positions history as something that is done to them, not done by them. And I think that's a really important a juxtaposition there. Perfect. And again, that alienation can really lead to superficial understanding. Students don't see themselves within historical narrative. Often we see students memorize content without understanding causation, context, perspective. And that historical knowledge is very shallow and easily forgotten. I know if there's a lot of history teachers in the audience, I'm sure you've had that uphill battle with students trying to have them engage with historical texts or concepts without trying to passively absorb information. And again, this discourages curiosity, critical questioning, and over time, students internalize the idea that history is fixed and uncontestable. And that's something I'm really passionate about within my studies. So we need to rethink history instruction. So we have quite a bit facing us, right? We need to expand historical narratives to be more inclusive and representative of the students we teach. We need to combat history's curricular reputation as boring, irrelevant. We have that uphill battle. We also need to empower educators and learners as co-collaborators in the creation of knowledge. So trying to move away from the teacher or textbook as ultimate authority and work as co-collaborators of knowledge within the classroom. And finally, help students to see that history is meaningful, contested, human, something they can engage with through developing their domain-specific skills within history. So that is a very tall order, and I know sometimes it can be so overwhelming to think about where to start with students. So I like to make some call sort of bite-sized, little pragmatic things you can use within your lessons to sort of dip your toe maybe into some of the materials that we have. So this is something that I made called Sourcing at First Sight. And so for me, it's introducing students to a new topic. Students need to develop both content knowledge and disciplinary skills. So something like this is a good way to have students start that process. Obviously, students need practice with sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and these skills do not exist in a vacuum. They can help students evaluate claims beyond the history classroom. And so we hope that engaging in certain historical practices can build deeper understanding and retention. So, for example, here you have I chose this image from the collection because it's very dramatic. It's something that if students have no knowledge of even labor history, unions, Arab American history, or anything that has to do with, the Ford plant, they might not be familiar with that, but this image just calls to you to dive in, right? There's chaos, there's violence, there's fighting, right? If I knew nothing about this, I would want to know what was happening in this image. And so that gives students an opportunity. And so breaking down 6 specific disciplinary skills that you can transparently discuss with your students also helps students realize that they need to know more than just the names and dates, right? They need to understand how to engage with historical sources. So I chose cause, change, empathy, time, evidence, and source. So you could do something where this is a warm-up for students, and you could say, what do you think might be the cause of this? There's no wrong answers right now. I just want you to brainstorm, what do you think caused what's happening in this photograph? What change is about to occur? When we're discussing empathy, how does this make you feel? How can you embody the perspectives of those within this image? Time, what time period do you think this is taking place? I know there's obviously a date here, but what visual signifiers within this photograph, reaffirm this date? What evidence do you derive from this source? And how valuable is this source to you within historical inquiry? This is just something you can use with your students, and you can always swap out, different images within something like this just to get students acclimated to this sort of historical thinking and kind of jumping on into new and diverse topics within the classroom. So again, this is just a great entry point into active historical inquiry. So it positions students as investigators from the very beginning, and I hope this sort of can get students on your side when discussing history. So talking more broadly about the educational resources, so just as there are multiple exhibits within the online module, I have made corresponding C3 lesson plans for each specific module within the website. And what I'm going to talk more about with you today is more of the overview C3 lesson. It's a shorter lesson, it's a broader lesson. I feel like it can fit very well within those tight curricular bounds. And I feel like every year that I taught US history, it was just a big race to the finish. So I understand how precious time can be with such tight timelines as educators, but I think this lesson can help you a little bit with that. So we chose the C3 framework to use to draft these lessons, and we really chose that because of and it's also called the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework, if you're not that familiar with it. Those of you in North Carolina are probably quite familiar with the C3 framework. But we chose it not only because of its alignment with North Carolina state standards, we also chose it because of its compelling 4 dimensions: developing questions, applying disciplinary concepts and skills, evaluating sources, and taking informed action. Something about this framework, it really speaks to some of the challenges in battling those epistemological underpinnings that sort of harm K-12 history instruction. So we thought that this active, student-centered, and inquiry-based approach was best for this material. And so you'll see here, each of the lessons start out, I really try to choose a very engaging image for the title page of each of the C3 lessons. Again, this is something you could easily pull and use for a sourcing at first sight sort of activity, right? So I think this is a very engaging photo. Really, you can only see his eyes, right? Like, what is he thinking? What is he doing? What's going on, right? There's engagement here. And so with each C3 lesson, there is obviously your compelling question here. So it begins with questions rather than content delivery. And the primary sources within the Arab American Labor website serve as the foundation for exploration and discussion with your students. So students will construct interpretations using evidence and their newly formed disciplinary skills. And I'm going to walk through this specific lesson just to talk about how that works. So first of all, labor can be a very familiar entry point for students in U.S. history courses. So they've probably heard of labor history before. They understand some of the topics discussed within labor history or using that lens to look at the past. So it allows students to encounter Arab American history without framing it as some sort of add-on content. And obviously the literature suggests that sometimes tacking on the stories of others without really seamlessly integrating it into your curriculum can be a bit alienating for students based on that. You know, it doesn't want to seem as like an afterthought, like, oh, I do need to be more inclusive in my instruction, and then you just kind of tack it on. We think it's really great that this can be integrated within your content, your curricular goals as well. So the inquiry asks, does the history of labor help us understand the Arab American experience? So students can start by discussing what they already know about labor and immigration. We have a section within each lesson that talks about how to introduce this compelling question to your students. And so through that discussion, you can really start to surface assumptions and gaps in prior knowledge that can also help you adapt the lesson to the needs of your learners. And opening with a primary source rather than a lecture allows students to engage in that sourcing at first sight. And the supporting questions here talk about what is missing from dominant narratives. So students are able to compare primary sources contained within this lesson to textbook representation. So we are getting students to dip their toes into the world of historiography. I'm incredibly passionate about historiography being included within a K-12 context. And I think small things like this can really get students to understand that, again, history is not uncontested or completely solved. It's something that has evolving interpretations. And I think that's very engaging for students to know. Again, the second asks, why have certain stories been ignored within the larger narrative? So some of the stories that you're going to learn from the content within the website, why have they been ignored within the historical narrative? So they're going to be able to construct claims using evidence and discuss why they think that is. And it also, finally, we ask how history changes, how this particular type of history changes their understanding of American history. So students are going to reflect and interpret rather than just summarize or regurgitate content knowledge back. And again, these questions, we hope they mirror how historians build their own arguments. And so within each supporting question, you have a follow-up performance task that can help students answer these questions along the way. And along with those formative performance tasks, there are curated sources from the collection that can help students answer these questions and help students reflect and engage. And then finally, create their summative performance task, which is an argument that they will construct. And again, across this inquiry, I have pulled different historical skills, trajectories, or you might call them domain-specific skills that go with each lesson as well. And I really encourage you, when you have these conversations with students, just as you might be transparent in discussing, hey, this is something that you've never maybe learned before in your history classes, I also encourage you to also be transparent with, hey, in this discussion, we're starting to step into historiography. We're starting to discuss prior interpretations of the past and how they've changed, right? I think that's a great thing to do with your students, to have those transparent conversations rather than feeling the need to embed that within the curriculum and feeling like you need to hide that from students. I think that transparency really goes a long way with learners. And again, why does all of this matter? Why do we need these materials? I hope that this approach helps you move to teaching history beyond the textbook It allows students to be historical thinkers. You're not only expanding the type of content within your classroom, but you're also engaging students in skill acquisition and development, and hopefully changing their, assumptions about the history classroom. Arab American labor history through this lens, it becomes central. It's not supplemental. I think that's a very important distinction here as well. That again, it is a central part of American history. It's not something supplemental that we only talk about briefly. And ultimately, I hope it helps students to see history as something that they do and not something that they simply receive. Again, this inquiry doesn't ask students to memorize a news story. It asks them to question how historical stories are built and whose labor has been left out of American history. And I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to me. I'm sure a lot of these things are not new to you. A lot of these things are things that you already apply in your own classroom. We're just trying to make a neat package of an under-taught history, an underexposed history, along with skill development, state standards, disciplinary acquisition as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. And we have another maybe 15 minutes or 14 minutes for Q&A. There are some questions here already. I will go ahead and try to answer the one that are addressed to me. And obviously, Lindsey is just this brilliant architect of the educational resources. She's done such a fabulous job with them. And we are basically at this point testing them in the classroom here in North Carolina. And that's a project that she is also spearheading. So I am so grateful for all that she does. So there was one question here about recommendations, and really in terms of, this idea about narrative media, about Arab American stories and labor and organizing, there really isn't anything that I've seen in terms of movies or TV shows that pertain to that in any real way. But if I'll let Mike know, I'm going to go do some digging. I'll let Mike know, and he might be able to share it with whoever signed up for this webinar. How central is the labor history of Arabs and Arab Americans to third and fourth generation Arab Americans? That's an excellent question. I really don't know fully the answer to that. However, what I can venture a guess is this. Because we are, I would say, I have a couple of colleagues who are studying labor history, Arab American labor history, and they have published scholarly works. But I would venture a guess that since we are the first public history project that is published about this, that this story is not widely known. It may be that within the families they have heard the stories, but certainly not in the way we are telling the stories as comprehensive as it is. But what I think is really interesting, especially I would say from 2019 forward, is that there's this new generation of Arab Americans who are very keenly tuned, very much like, by the way, that I would say their parents of the 1960s and 70s, to this idea of intersectionality, this idea of building collaborations with other groups, including labor. So I think there's a real deep recognition that the story of Arab Americans, although, one can tell certain specific things about it, it resonates with a lot of people because I don't think it's necessarily in of itself unique. And so I think you begin to see this generation that is building these bridges and building a lot of collaborative work. And then finally, the question that is also addressed to me is about the restrictions that I mentioned in terms of, immigration. There is no doubt that currently we are seeing a similar language that was used in the early 1910s and 1920s. We see a similar hostility to non-white immigrants now. We see restrictions that are being played out in different ways in which, because it is, although racial profiling is illegal in immigration law currently anyway, there are ways in which people get around it. Obviously, this current administration is doing that. And so we are seeing restrictions. And even though they may not be talking about trachoma, as I addressed earlier, the fact of the matter is what is interesting is they're still seeing the same kind of language, i.e., immigrants are indolent. And here I would point you to what has been said about Somalis in Minneapolis. Immigrants quote unquote, taint the blood of Americans. Again, this kind of nativist, nationalist, kind of, ultra nationalist really kind of language was used by things like the KKK and, anti-immigrant activists, eugenics people from the early 20th century. When you hear people talking about low IQs, when you hear people talking about immigrants as criminals, immigrants as vectors of, disease, those are the same tropes, the same language that was used for the early Arab Americans, and not only them, by the way. It was used against Poles, it was used against, as I said, Italians and Greeks and Jews and so on and so forth. So this is nothing, sadly enough, there's nothing new in the language that's being used, but what is really shocking now is how it's given full throat support. Well, actually, not even support. It's being, voiced from the highest level of governments in the United States. So the next question is about whether there are any resources to help first, second, and third generation family members research ancestry and how their family members immigrated to the United States. Yes, there are. So I would say that, for example, if we work with the center has been working with Family Search to make some data available. So right now you can actually go to our website, and we have digitized a lot of the early census records, and we have filtered them out to include, to basically select the ones who are called Syrians, again, the term used for early Arab Americans. So there's a census data that is available through our website. As I mentioned, we have newspaper databases, and those newspaper databases are incredibly rich with genealogical data, so there's that. I would recommend, of course, things like Ancestry and Family Search. Family Search is free, so you don't have to pay for it. And actually, what's really interesting is you can look under the label Syrian, and it'll pull up names. If you have family names, you can try to look up those names as well. And it will pull up records from, ship manifests, Ellis Island records, census records. It'll pull up from a variety of things. So there are ways, and I think there's an organization that is called Arab American Genealogical Society, or something of that sort. I'm not sure if that's exactly the name of it. And they hold webinars that help train a little bit or give you pointers. And again, offline, I'm happy to help you with any information that you need in terms of Arab American ancestry. And by the way, Christine, the Ma'louf family is from Zahle, modern day Lebanon, and the Ma'loufs are all over the map in terms of immigration. I think Zahle produced a lot of immigrants, and many of them were from the Ma'louf clan, if you will.
Good deal, everyone, and thank you for your questions. I see that the conversation is still ongoing in the audience chat, and I'll remind you, we'll close out here shortly. But if you have any additional questions about the instructional resources that are available, as well as just touching on many of the topics that Dr. Khater focused on, please feel free to include them in the chat at this time. And Lindsey, if you will, early on, someone asked about going back to that QR code slide. So I'd be happy to advance back to that as well. And I'll let you, and I'll let you all know that I dropped that link in the chat earlier as well, and I will drop it in there again for you all to be able to access that. And that's, Lindsey, that's StoryMap's platform. Is that right? Is that ArcGIS? Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, it is.
I see it in there. Okay. Yes, I see it right there. I see it there.
And I also want to emphasize that, if you guys have, if you use these things, we would love for you to use them in your classroom, to test them out, to use them with your students. And we would love your feedback to hear how we can help more with this, because this is one of those things that we're trying to figure out. And I have to say, I tip my hat to the National Humanities Center, not only for giving us a space for the webinar, but because they really are pioneer and leaders in creating resources for teachers. And I think, especially in an environment where we're seeing a retreat from providing support for teachers every day. I think the National Humanities Center stands as an incredible organization, and we would be happy to work with them because we have a lot of other projects that we want to see if, are these resources useful? Are they being used? And if that's the case, we will continue to try to develop them, especially in collaboration with the National Humanities Center.
Absolutely. And yeah, and Akram, I look forward to the conversation. Again, I spoke about the Understand the Modern Middle East, which was pre-pandemic, which seems so long ago. But having developed that course with you and just this initiative now, the work that you all are doing. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and thinking through the ways that we can support getting these resources out. So very important. There's another question in the chat.
Yeah, saw that. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to take question number 6, the one that looks like number 6 on mine. And are there any significant examples of surveillance on the labor movement to suppress workers' rights that have been buried in history? I mean, listen, their labor history has been incredibly researched. Really, I mean, of course, I'm critiquing it in the sense that it has elided or kept out this particular group of Americans. But in general, there's just been amazing work on labor history, and they do talk. There's a lot of works out there at the scholarly level that talk about surveillance, but not only surveillance, of course, suppression. I mean, this is very common. In fact, the image that Lindsey showed was specifically about an attack by Ford factory workers or from a particular department, which is really kind of their thugs department, honestly, to attack UAW organizers. So surveillance and suppression were very common. Of course, in Lawrence, Massachusetts, you begin to see all sorts of surveillance developing with the Bread and Roses strikes. So I don't think much of it is buried, quite honestly, because there's, Mireille, there's actually quite a bit that has been written about it. But, and there are some things, for example, in the 1960s, 70s, there was a massive surveillance program about Arab Americans in which they were followed, and the FBI was carried out, the FBI, again, because of that suspicion that Arabs are, quote unquote, the terrorists, other, if you will. And so, yeah, there was surveillance then. And of course, after 9/11, you see the same thing. As for question number 5, which is the Middle East is a diverse place, is excellent point by Talim. And, is it possible to show diversity of the Middle East? Yes, of course. I mean, obviously, our center is focused on the history of immigrants, so we look a lot outside. But in many ways, the project itself tried not to kind of create a collapsed term called Arab Americans. We really problematized it because when we talked about Yemeni farm workers, we talked about them as part of a larger whole, but still their own unique selves. When we talked about auto workers, we also included Assyrians from Iraq, many of whom do not necessarily self-identify as, Arab in the sense because they were persecuted by the Iraqi regime. So we do try to create diversity within the representation in our focus. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to the Middle East, we cannot speak about it in any singular way. And a lot of the works on the Middle East, I might add, are doing exactly what Talim is asking for, which is greater diversity. It used to be that the history of the Middle East was told as a political history about quote-unquote great men and great ideas and, Britain and Ottoman Sultan and so on and so forth. But the reality is we're beginning to see a lot of social history and a lot of, especially now, an emerging movement towards public history that I actually am very proud to be part of, that does exactly what you're saying, Talim. That is, it problematizes a lot of the stories that we are taught in history in the Middle East, and I work with organizations in the Middle East to do that, by the way. So, but thank you for the question. Great question. And I think, Mike, I guess it's time to wrap it up since we're at 8:20.
Yes, absolutely. Again, I can't say enough how much I've appreciated having you all here. And again, you can see the expressions of gratitude throughout the chat. Just everyone, just thanking you all for being here. And again, I just look forward to continue to follow this work and support any way we can. Lindsey, if you will, I noticed you put your email in the chat for any feedback that you all have that the teacher should have. So if you will drop that in there again, because that chat moves along really quickly for anyone who did not get it. So feel free
Sure
to
thing.
drop it there. Also, everyone, again, I encourage you, as always, to stay in touch with all that's happening at the National Humanities Center. You can follow us at nationalhumanitycenter.org, on our various social media pages, National Humanities and or NHC Education. If you have to reach out to me, you can reach out to mwilliams at nationalhumanitycenter.org or nhc_ed at nationalhumanitycenter.org. There's quite a bit that's going on in the coming months, as I mentioned earlier, about the institutes that are coming this summer. We also have the application window opening for our annual Teacher Advisory Council, if you're so inclined to join us. And again, the remaining webinars of the season. Support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. Again, I encourage you to support the NHC Humanities. Again, we have a QR code. I'm looking for it. Yep, have a QR code up in the top left corner if you need to access that. So February is pretty much here already. So we will be back on February 3rd for Restorative Digital Humanities, or Histories, Cultural Memory, and Justice-Centered Pedagogy. February 3rd with Tanisha L. Taylor, who is a professor of communication studies. She's the director of the Center for Africana Futures at Texas Southern University. Again, February is here, but we will be back next week. We also have Luis Martinez, who's going to be here on that Thursday. So 2 webinars next week. Looking forward to having you all here. Again, as always, if I can support you all in the work you're doing, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much, Akram. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for being here tonight. And most of all, thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to come back and hang out with us. We appreciate you and look forward to seeing you soon. All right, take care and be well.